It started with something so minor most people would expect it to end in a warning, maybe a ticket, and a few frustrated minutes on the side of the road. Instead, it became the kind of case that sticks in the public mind for years. In the early morning darkness of Colorado Springs, a Navy veteran named Dalvin Gadsden was pulled over while driving slowly in a car without a visible license plate. What happened next turned a routine stop into a violent arrest, a federal lawsuit, dismissed criminal charges, a multi-million-dollar settlement, and one question that still hangs over the entire case. How does a city pay $2? $1 million over an arrest this brutal while the officers involved remain on the job? That is the story. And the reason it matters goes far beyond one traffic stop in one American city. Because this case forces us to look at a hard truth about power in America. Not just how it is used, but what happens when the system decides that a violent mistake is still not enough to end a career. So tonight, we are walking through the stop, the body cam footage, the legal fallout, and the public message left behind when the man who got beaten sees his charges disappear, sees the city write a huge check, and still watches the officers keep their badges. This is not just a story about force. It is a story about accountability. Dalvin Gadsden was not wanted for a violent crime. He was not the subject of a manhunt. He was not accused of armed robbery, murder, or carjacking. According to reporting and public statements around the case, he was pulled over in the early hours of October 9, 2022, after police noticed he was driving about 15 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone, and that the vehicle had no visible license plate. That was the starting point. A traffic stop over a missing tag. Police later said the encounter shifted into a DUI investigation after officers reported smelling cannabis coming from the vehicle. And that is where the encounter began to move out of the category of ordinary inconvenience and into something much more dangerous. Because traffic stops are not just common. They are one of the most common points of contact between ordinary Americans and law enforcement. Millions happen every year. Most end without violence. That is exactly why cases like this land so heavily. They confront people with the fear that an everyday stop can turn into a life-changing event in a matter of seconds. And in Gadsden's case, the escalation happened fast. Body camera footage later released to the public showed officers approaching the vehicle, asking to see hands, calling for backup, and telling Gadsden to remain in the car. There is a strange tension in footage like this. At first glance, everything looks procedural. Commands are given, questions are asked, IDs are requested. On paper, it still resembles a normal roadside stop. But then you watch more closely. You see the pressure building, you hear the shift in tone, and you realize everyone involved is moving toward a confrontation that no one seems able or willing to slow down. Police said Gadsden refused to leave the vehicle so officers could conduct sobriety testing. His attorneys later argued that officers escalated to violence without the kind of warning and restraint the moment required. Those two stories sit at the center of the case. On one side, police described resistance. On the other, Gadsden's lawyers described a frightened man stopped over a tag violation who was beaten out of a car. And that difference matters, because so many controversial police cases turn on that exact divide. Was this a necessary use of force against someone refusing lawful commands? Or was noncompliance used as the justification for force that went far beyond what the situation called for? That is where the footage became so important. When the body cam video surfaced, it changed the case from an argument about paperwork to an argument about what people could see with their own eyes. The footage showed officers trying to remove Gadsden from the vehicle after he did not get out when ordered. During the struggle, he was struck in the head and body. Reporting on the case described him being punched and kicked. His lawsuit alleged that officers beat him violently during the arrest. The video did what video often does in cases like this. It stripped away the protective distance of official language, because official language has a way of muting reality. Use of force, physical compliance. Officer response? Those phrases sound clean. The footage did not. It showed the chaos, the blows, the shouting, and the imbalance of power between a man in a vehicle and multiple officers pulling him out. It showed why the case immediately became bigger than a local traffic stop story. And it showed why so many people looked at the incident and saw not discipline, not control, but a system crossing a line. Now, to be fair, officers are allowed to give lawful orders during a stop, and refusing those orders can escalate an encounter. That is real. That is part of the legal framework police operate under. But the public does not judge cases like this based only on whether a command was lawful. People judge them based on proportion. What was the original reason for the stop? What threat actually existed? What options did officers have? And when force was used, did it feel necessary or did it feel punitive? That is the question at the heart of this entire story. Because once the stop became physical, the original violation never really disappeared. It stayed in the background the whole time, shaping how the public understood everything that followed. A missing plate? A slow-moving car? A suspected DUI investigation? and then a violent arrest caught on body cam. That contrast is why the case exploded. If this had begun with a hostage situation, an armed suspect, or a direct threat to officers or bystanders, the public conversation would have been different. But that is not what this looked like. What people saw was a roadside stop over a low-level issue ending in a level of force many believed was wildly out of scale. And then came the next chapter, the one that so often decides whether public outrage fades or deepens: the charges. After the arrest, Gadsden was charged with serious offenses, including assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstructing a peace officer, DUI, and driving without license plates. This is another familiar pattern in American policing. Once force is used, the legal narrative often shifts immediately toward the suspect's alleged behavior. The focus moves away from what officers did and toward the idea that the person caused the force by resisting. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is partly true. And sometimes those charges collapse the moment the evidence is tested more carefully. In this case, all of the charges were eventually dismissed. That fact is central to understanding why the settlement mattered so much. Because when the criminal case falls apart, it changes the public reading of everything that came before it. The man first presented as the problem is no longer standing under conviction. The legal foundation for the official story gets weaker. And the body cam footage suddenly carries even more weight. The city may not say the settlement is an admission of wrongdoing. Governments almost never frame it that way. But ordinary people understand what a $2 or $1 million payment looks like. It looks like risk. It looks like exposure. It looks like a city deciding that taking this case to trial might be even more damaging than settling it. In May of 2024, Colorado Springs City Council voted 7-1 to approve a $2, $1 million settlement in the case. That number immediately changed the scale of the story. This was no longer just a disturbing arrest video from the local news cycle. Now it was a multi-million-dollar reckoning backed by taxpayer money. And that is when the most uncomfortable question became unavoidable. If the case was serious enough for the city to pay that much, what happened to the officers? The answer is what made the story linger. The officers involved were not fired. Reporting at the time said the 3 officers remained employed and in good standing with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Earlier reporting also indicated that they had been found to have acted within department policy, even as the case drew intense criticism and later ended in a major settlement. That combination is what makes the story so difficult for institutions to explain, because each part points in a different direction. The footage suggests a disturbing level of force. The criminal case against Gadsden disappears. The city agrees to pay $2, $1 million, and yet the officers remain employed. To a department defending its own process, these outcomes may exist in separate categories. Internal review is one thing, civil liability is another, criminal charges are another, employment status is another. Bureaucratically, the system can divide them, but the public does not experience the story that way. The public sees one continuous event. A man is pulled over. He is beaten during the arrest. His charges are dropped. The city pays millions. The officers keep their jobs. That sequence does enormous damage to trust because it creates the impression that accountability is something the public pays for, not something individuals face. And that impression is devastating, because once people begin to believe that consequences are financial but not personal, every future case feels pre-explained. A lawsuit will come, a settlement may follow, taxpayers will carry the cost, and the people who use the force may remain protected unless the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. That is the deeper meaning of this case. Not just whether officers were right or wrong in a split-second decision, but whether American institutions are structured to absorb public outrage without truly reforming themselves. And to understand why that matters, you have to step back from Colorado Springs and look at the broader pattern. In case after case across the country, civil settlements have become one of the main visible forms of accountability after controversial police encounters. Families sue, cities settle, numbers make headlines. But those payments often come from public funds, insurance structures, or municipal budgets, not from the officers personally. So the public watches a strange ritual play out. The system says, in effect, this incident was costly enough to deserve millions, but not costly enough to remove the people involved from power. That contradiction is corrosive. It teaches viewers, voters, and communities to separate justice from resolution. A case can be resolved on paper while still feeling morally unresolved in the public mind. And Gadsden's case fits that pattern almost perfectly. There's another layer here that is impossible to ignore. Dalvin Gadsden was reported to be homeless at the time, living out of his car. He was also a veteran. Those details do not legally change the use of force analysis, but they shape how the public reads the story. Because people hear that and ask a brutally simple question. If this is how the system treats a veteran already in a vulnerable situation, what does that say about everyone else with less visibility, less legal support, or no video at all? That is why cases like this travel so far. They are never only about the individual in the footage. They become stand-ins for a wider fear that ordinary instability, confusion, or hesitation in the presence of police can trigger force first and explanation later. And to be clear, none of this means every disputed arrest is simple. Real life is messy. Officers deal with uncertain situations, suspects do resist, commands are ignored, intoxication changes behavior, roadside encounters are unpredictable, but uncertainty is not a blank check. That is the principle people keep coming back to. A difficult stop is not the same thing as an unlimited stop. And if the public begins to believe that hesitation alone can justify severe force, then every traffic stop starts to carry a more dangerous meaning. That is why body cam footage has become so politically powerful. It does not end debate, but it narrows the space in which abstract language can hide concrete violence. And in this case, the footage did something else. It made the aftermath harder to sell. Because when officers remain employed after a high-profile video, after drop charges, and after $2, 1 million settlement, people do not just question one department. They question the entire architecture of accountability. Who investigates whom? What standard is being applied? How can conduct be serious enough to cost millions and still not serious enough to cost a badge? Those are not rhetorical questions anymore. They are now central to how many Americans judge police legitimacy itself. That does not mean every viewer reaches the same conclusion. Some will still argue Gadsden should have complied more quickly. Some will say officers were dealing with a non-compliant driver in a tense roadside setting and had to regain control. Others will look at the same footage and see force that went far beyond what the situation justified. But even among people who disagree on the moment of arrest, the settlement and employment outcome create a separate and broader issue. What does accountability actually mean if institutions can acknowledge enormous civil exposure without imposing equally visible institutional consequences? That is the part no press release can easily fix. And it is why this case still matters. Not because it is uniquely shocking in American life, but because it is painfully familiar. A low-level stop becomes a violent encounter. Charges are filed. Video changes public perception. Charges disappear. The city pays. And the system tries to move on. But the public memory does not move on that easily anymore. Too many people have seen too many versions of this story. And that is where the real significance of the Gadsden case lives, not only in what happened on that road in 2022, but in what the outcome told the country afterward. It told people that a multi-million-dollar settlement does not automatically mean institutional self-correction. It told people that public money can function as a pressure valve. And it told people that even when the criminal case against the civilian falls apart, the burden of proving professional unfitness inside the department may remain astonishingly high. That is a dangerous lesson for any city to teach, because trust in law enforcement does not survive on slogans. It survives on the public belief that when something goes badly wrong, the system can recognize it clearly, punish it fairly, and prevent it from happening again. When that belief weakens, every future stop inherits the damage. And that may be the real cost of this case. The cost that does not show up in the settlement figure, the loss of confidence, the widening suspicion, the idea that justice can be expensive without being complete. So when people look at the Gadsden case, they are not just looking at one arrest, they are looking at a test of whether visible violence, dismissed charges, and a massive payout are enough to trigger meaningful accountability. In Colorado Springs, at least in the eyes of many critics, that test was failed. The city paid, the officers stayed, and the public was left to decide what that says about the system as a whole. If you want the most honest summary of this story, it may be this: a traffic stop over a missing plate turned into a violent arrest. The charges against the man who was beaten did not survive. The city agreed to pay $2 1 million, and the officers involved remained employed. Everything else is an argument over what those facts mean. But those facts alone are why this case still resonates. Because for many people, they describe a country where the price of misconduct can be counted in dollars, while the consequences for power remain much harder to find. If you want more deeply reported stories like this, cases where the official version, the footage, and the outcome do not neatly line up, subscribe and stay with us. Because the most important part of stories like this is not just what happened. It is what the system does after everyone has seen it.